Alright, what's good, you guys? So this is part 2 of my 2025 season review grades for the top 10. Obviously, in this portion, we'll be picking up where we left off, 6 through 10 season grades for 2025, and then working backwards, going down the line from 1 to 10 for year-end 2026 top 10 predictions. Also touching on some of the people I have on the outside looking in that are also relevant in this conversation and subject to make some noise this coming tennis season. So without further ado, I will slide the floor over to past me. At number 6, Taylor Fritz. In the first half of the year, he struggled, I think, with an abdominal injury and just had his fair share of minor injuries that, off a career best year in 2024, made for a really disappointing first half of 2025, where his ranking, I think, actually dipped quite a bit from that year-end number 4 last year. But then we get to July, grass court season on. He pretty much is that same player that we saw throughout the course of 2024 through to the end of the year, and he feels like the 4th best player in tennis through the second half. And Fritz is the first of, I think, at least multiple guys in this top 10 that I think is somewhere within the realm of his final form. This is probably the only guy within the 90s gen right now that I would say is very much in the thick of his prime, as opposed to some of the younger players we've touched upon. No identity crisis whatsoever. Taylor Fritz has rounded into pretty much exactly the player that you would want him to be to make the most out of his talents. And yeah, there's things on the margins you can always improve on, especially for him when you look to punching above his weight class. It'll never hurt, improving on the margins, making the smallest of gains as a mover, which Fritz has done incrementally over the last couple of years, and in particular the forecourt stuff, really, which still is a work in progress, but you can see the vision as to how much that'd help the cause, especially when more and more committing to being this bang guy behind one of the best serves on tour now. He is what he is, and, he stands right now in a place where he's a bit of a gatekeeper. Not a bad thing at all when you are able to pretty effortlessly impose yourself upon everybody down from Tier 1, your new 2, and Novak Djokovic still having a chokehold on him. And even still, in those matches, you can see the gears turning in his head. There's a good enough game plan there for him, even the odds against him. Most of those outings against Sinkaraz and Novak, they were quite competitive. I mean, again, you can see from a tennis standpoint, Fritz is doing all the right things. You do still see the nerviness, especially in those tight pressure moments, show up. Those are really the only times you see a little bit of indecisiveness creep in for him. But again, if you're working with just lesser innate abilities than all those guys, and you're finding a way to give yourself a chance, you can't really ask for much more. Where I will ask for a little bit more, though, is, you talk about a gatekeeper, and you talk about Taylor Fritz being in the prime of his career, which I do believe he is firmly entrenched in. Even though Fritz's consistency has upped to a very, very good level over the course of an 11-month season, and his rankings will reflect that at the end of the year, the last 2 seasons, even though a lot of these losses are not early, it does feel like some meat is being left on the bone. And I'm talking even taking the second half of this season, which was objectively very successful for him. From a week-to-week basis, I do feel like, for a guy that I consider to be a gatekeeper, he's more upset-prone than you would like. And in terms of, winning titles, you see it reflected in the fact that I do feel like, you should be coming away with more than just a couple of 250s every season, especially for someone who I feel like plays quite a bit more than most guys on tour. And again, someone that I feel is right smack dab in the middle of their prime. But yeah, otherwise, I think he's doing all the right things. And when grading his season, really strong second half, equally disappointing first half. But he ends 2025 more or less the same player as he was a year ago. which sets him up nicely in 2026, but his season overall just felt like a lesser version of 2024, and that too doing it for just half the year this time around. So I'll give it a grade of a B-. At number 7, actually a lot of the same stuff can be said about Alex de Minaur. In 2024, his momentum was brought to a full stop after sustaining that severe injury on match point at Wimbledon in the 4th round, I believe. This year, he avoids that major injury, and that allows him to be available throughout the course of the entire season. But availability aside, I would also say of his 2025 felt like a little bit of a lesser version of the year he had in 2024. Albeit, also another guy I think where he is capped out right now. This is about as good as it's going to get. A couple of improvements here or there on the margins as well can help for him. But overall, you're doing just about everything right. And this was a revelation last season when de Minaur seemed to bulk up a little bit. And as a result, his game seemed to have a lot more teeth to it than ever before. And when you've always been one of the fastest players in tennis, who's always struggled with a little bit of a power deficit, what a difference that has made. He's playing the right way to minimize those instances where the racket can just be taken out of his hand, which, of course, that's still subject to happening against someone on a purple patch, or just like one of those tier 1 guys having one of those days where it's not at all in his control. But even for that matter, I feel like de Minaur, you've seen enough instances the last 2 years to say that I think we have enough of a track record to say that de Minaur is more than exceeding his end of the bargain when it comes to close the gap as much as humanly possible. And yes, you look at the head-to-heads, he's seldom winning these matches, but compared to what it was pre-2024, even against like tier 1 opposition where this guy was like a lock to be bullied against them every single time, you look at the last 2 years, he's beaten Djokovic at United Cup, also played him tough this year at Wimbledon, played Alcaraz as well as he could in Rotterdam as well, and then his ultimate boogeyman in Yannick, just a matchup from hell. But I've seen enough there. Even like he took his first set, I think, if not ever in a really long time, off of Sinner in Beijing, and played him quite respectably, honestly, in Vienna and Turin as well. Their last 3 matches of the season, positive trajectory even in that head-to-head, even if it doesn't look it on the surface. The point being, I mean, realistically, given the gap in abilities and Alex's limitations, that gap will never be completely bridged, but he is absolutely doing everything he can and squeezing every last drop out of himself to be able to best punch up. The issue, I think, actually, for de Minaur is for a guy that's a grinder and has this rap of being such a great fighter, which he absolutely is. The guy plays with such heart. That's really what propelled him to his biggest win of the season, with beating Davidovich Fokina and administering one of the most heartbreaking defeats of the season for anybody in the final of Washington, D.C. But given the way that he plays, I do feel like de Minaur should be a little bit clutcher than he is, especially for a guy that's, priding himself on out-soliding you. He's doing exceptionally well, actually. I think about as well as he can in trying to hang with the guys that are probably a bridge too far and just up a weight class from him. It's really those in and around the same ilk as de Minaur, and it shows because, this season until Laver Cup, I believe, de Minaur had not won a single match, I believe, against the top 10, and it took until Turin, where he beat Taylor Fritz, for him to get one outside of Laver Cup. And Demon himself, I think, was sort of hitting on this, critical of himself in this respect, when he was pretty down on himself after blowing the match to Musetti at the Tour Finals in Turin. And yeah, I mean, checks out. You look at some of the pressure stats, like his deciding set record is not particularly great. His 5th set record is particularly poor, actually. And yeah, I mean, you see a couple of sliding doors matches this year that could have made his season even better, that he just tightened up or couldn't find that little extra something. Such matches including the Monte Carlo semi against Musetti, maybe the 5-set loss to Bublik from 2 sets up at Roland Garros, aforementioned round-robin match with Musetti in Turin, and the biggest example, I think, was the US Open quarter this year. Most of that run, Felix was lights out. It would have been one thing if that was the case and he just took the racket out of Alex's hands in that quarter, but that's not what happened. Like, he was easily the most beatable of his matches at that tournament, was Felix in that match. And Demon really could have put it to bed. He should have probably gone up 2-0. But the difference in that match, scrappy as it was, ended up being Felix was notably a lot clutcher, handled the pressure moments a lot better, won 3 tiebreaks after dropping the first. And that's really the microcosm of where I think de Minaur has some room to build upon. Any of the outcome of those matches flipping, you're probably looking at like a B plus here, but I'll just say because of the lack of huge wins, this is a B- year for what I've come to expect of Alex de Minaur over the last 2 years, and that on its own is a huge win, because before 2 years ago, consecutive Tour Finals appearances would have never been in the cards for me for Alex de Minaur, and that speaks volumes about how far he's come. Number 8, and your last one into Turin, Lorenzo Musetti, and boy, what a January through June it was for Musetti. Not only did he prove that the surge has been very real since that, really that titanic match against Novak Djokovic at Roland Garros in 2024, but he built upon it big time, with the crux of his season obviously being the clay court season, where once he got onto the dirt, you would probably be hard-pressed this season to say that anyone else was the 3rd best player on clay this year. Honestly, if you think about it, this is probably one of the best clay court seasons of recent memory, done by someone that wasn't one of the superhumans. It's right up there with 2021 Tsitsipas, a handful of team ones at the back end of the 2010s, a handful of rude ones over the last couple years as well. But yeah, I mean, he goes final Monte Carlo, semi-Madrid, semi-Rome, and semi-Roland Garros. And in 3 out of those 4 events, it was the guy in Carlos Alcaraz who had clearly the best clay court season this season. And in all 3 of those matches, they were mostly quite competitive. In Monte Carlo and Roland Garros, Musetti, the physical attrition of it all ended up overwhelming him late. And honestly, in the Roland Garros one, he was redlining to a degree that we have seldom seen, and even sort of flirted with potentially a 2-set lead against Alcaraz. Super, super respectable, and I feel pretty comfortable saying, Musetti, at this point, he just has the natural surfaces covered, and especially on clay. This clay court season, he was beating the rest. A couple of the next-gen guys obviously have loved clay, and he notched multiple wins on Tsitsipas. He beat Zverev in Rome. Stellar stuff, and of course, after 2 sets in the semifinals of Roland Garros, he ends up getting hurt, has nothing left, and that marred much of the next couple of months. I do feel on grass even, while it was just the flash last year where he made Final of Queens and semis of Wimbledon, his tools just do seem pretty good for grass. He has one of the best slices, if not maybe the best right now. I'm ready to chalk up him flopping on grass this year to the fact that he wasn't healthy, because he clearly wasn't. It wasn't enough time to fully recover from his injury. And then, obviously, the next couple of months, hard courts have still proven to be the final puzzle for Lore, and I do feel like the combination of having to build from the ground back after that injury at Roland Garros, plus him being drastically more vulnerable on hard courts as it is, it resulted in just a dismal couple of results up until the US Open. But even on that front, big progress to end the year from US Open to the finish of the season. And especially given the form coming into the US Open, there was no reason to think he'd make the quarters there. But he picked up a couple of nice wins, made his first real deep run at a hardcourt major. That was a nice thing to tick off. And yes, in heartbreaking fashion, immediately after that, he was unable to snap his title drought. A little bit of an interesting tidbit there that came about as a result of that final, him having the match points against Tabilo, unable to finish the job, but Musetti titleless, actually, since 2022. Obviously, down the stretch became a bit of a thing looming over his head with what looked like a race for the last spot in Turin between him and Felix. And for the most part, that pressure was not something he dealt with particularly great. But I will say, in his last two events of the year, in addition to that US Open result, I thought some real progress shown on hard courts. Post-US Open tennis obviously doesn't always translate, but even had Novak played Turin and Musetti ended up being shut out this year, absolutely nothing to hang his head about with the effort he put in the final of Athens in his last push to make it. Djokovic and him played one of the better matches of the season. Really, really high quality, and obviously he showed up to Turin a little knackered, fatigued from all the efforts to make it there. But then his match against Minaur was one of the most incredible spectacles as well, with the home crowd just completely willing him on to the finish line in a match where he looked dead and buried in the third set. And it was those handful of matches watching him where you really saw the vision there for him to become quite competent on a hard court, honestly. It felt like he understood, even if by virtue of fatigue against Minaur in particular, that he needed to go bigger on his forehand, serve bigger, and you saw a capacity there for him to do it in ways that maybe he hasn't shown before. And obviously, I think Musetti is so unique in the fact that he just weaponizes playing defense in a way that's very, very rare on the tour right now. But it was nice to see him deploy that and see that that was in his back pocket. And for a guy that, we were introduced to him so early while he was still a teenager, it doesn't feel like he's that young, but he is 23 going on 24 this year. And given the leaps that he has taken over the last two seasons now, I think there's still plenty of reason for optimism to think that there's maybe a gear or two there for him still to tap into moving forward. So even if injuries made this season a bit uneven for him, just the fact that he had such a strong, amazing clay court season, honestly, plus real gains, I thought, on hard court, I give his season a solid B. Number 9, Ben Shelton. Straight off the bat, I think this was a very, very productive year for Ben. And relative to expectations, I think right up to the US Open, you would probably slot this year as an easy, B+, maybe even flirting with A territory after he took out his maiden Masters title in Toronto. And with Ben as a guy that, relative to his peers, committed to professional tennis a bit later in his life, it's easy to forget that this was just his third full year on the Pro Tour, and flaws and all, and they are still glaringly there. I would say in particular on return more than anything else, he just remains big time. You can poke holes all you want, that his deep runs at slams have benefited from draws opening up for him, Sinner and Alcaraz not present when he won in Toronto, etc., etc. But the fact of the matter is, projected matchups you see from draws when they come out, they so rarely all across the board come to fruition. More often than not, they don't. And especially in a year like 2025, where, again, outside of the Tier 1 guys, much of the top 20, honestly, was injured, out of form, whatever the case may be. Upsets were just inevitable, and again, Ben Shelton even relatively early in his career, technical deficiencies aside, one thing that has been proven and has been able to rise above all of that has definitely been his big match performance. The surface level statistics in his year this year alone tell that. Not a particularly high win tally, and definitely a ways to go for him still. You would like for him to be a better performer in best of 3, no doubt about it. But at the majors, he went semis Australia, round of 16 at Roland Garros, and that match in particular, to this point, Ben has been deep at slams plenty, and it hasn't been particularly close once he ran into one of those tier 1 guys. Except for that match against Carlos Alcaraz at Roland Garros this year, was one of the more entertaining of the entire season, honestly. He gave Alcaraz everything he could handle, had real chances in each of the opening 2 sets. In a match he lost in tight 4, but then you get quarters, Wimbledon. Both Australia and Wimbledon ends up losing to Jannik Sinner, who has been something of a boogeyman for him. Has really struggled to keep things competitive, really, with Sinner over the last 2 years. And then again, we were all looking at Rogers Cup, no Sinner, no Alcaraz. Okay, this is a great opportunity for someone to get a Masters on the board, or somebody that needs the confidence boost that's been there before, like a Zverev, Medvedev, whatever the case may be. And out of everybody, it ends up being Ben Shelton, who rises to the occasion. And really, that run onwards, the limited sample we saw up till the US Open, even technically, I thought I saw some real growth there for Ben. Seemed more willing and capable as a defender, more patient than ever before. Obviously, a ways to go still, especially as a returner. But hey, I felt like even that got better. He was breaking a little bit, just that much more often. Not where it needs to be, but baby steps. And it was very unfortunate, the timing of his injury. Obviously, he was in the Alcaraz quarter at the US Open, so his tournament likely ends there at the US Open anyways, but he was playing easily probably the best tennis of his career. Looked like, albeit in a battle with Manarino, that match was going to go his way had his arm not gone on him. Obviously, with how big he plays, you just hope that's a blip in the radar and not something with the dominant arm that ends up lingering. And even so, it did really halt his momentum. Even coming back at the end of the year, he didn't look like the same guy. I'm confident he can recapture that, get back to being that guy with the offseason. And overall, big gains for Ben Shelton in 2025. He does still, again, read as a guy that only just completed his 3rd full year on tour. He still feels very, very raw. He's one of those guys that I do feel is not even close to reaching his final form. And I think it's that much more encouraging that despite that, he's just ticking off these pretty big accomplishments so early on in his career as still a bit of a prospect rather than close to a finished product. Now semis at 2 of the 4 slams, quarters at 3 of the 4 slams, a big title now under his belt with the Masters, with still plenty of upside to grow into. I think you really see the outline of a fantastic player in the near future. And, you just can't teach those gamer qualities he's just seemingly been born with. So, overall, in the big picture, I give his 2025 a B. And then rounding out the top 10, you got Jack Draper, a guy who so early on in the season, I realized, having not projected him to end top 10 at the beginning of the year, I was about to take a big L. Hell, this guy was probably finishing top 5 this year, if we're being realistic, had he kept on. The pace that he had shown was sustainable and, sort of who he was for the entire first 6 months of this season. And of the younger guys, outside of Sinner Alcaraz, of course, outside of the demigods, Jack Draper most definitely, in every way, showed a very clear amount of readiness to take the leap. Whether that be, I think, in a conditioning sense, whether that be, in an identity sense, something I've talked about a lot with a lot of the younger guys. Draper, it felt like something clicked in terms of finding the perfect balance and having clarity in how he wants to play in the summer of 2024, and particularly making the US Open semis in such convincing, dominant fashion. I believe also winning Vienna, and then spilling that over into the new year in 2025, even in an off-season of 2024 that was quite compromised by another hip injury. And of course, that's where the trepidation has come in for Jack Draper, and it's only amplified, of course, with the second half of 2025 for him almost entirely gone out the window with this arm injury that will keep him out of Australia as well into 2026. And that's the part that everybody's going to have trepidation about. That's the part that leaves you wanting so much, because it really does feel like Jack Draper now, 24 years of age. It's sort of around this time where so many of the greats end up turning a bit of a corner. And tennis-wise, I think we have enough tape now to say that Jack Draper very much is there. He's ready to be one of tennis's elites. You could argue that, those first 6 months of 2025, maybe he is like the third, fourth best player in tennis, pretty clearly. I feel like that Indian Wells title probably is pretty clearly the best Masters run, one of the best big tournament runs all year. Like, he took big name scalp after big name. I think it's worth noting, even given the fact that we know how much his offseason was hampered, going straight to Australia, winning I think 2 or 3 5-setters. That again, from a conditioning standpoint, I think his body is there. It's just the durability. And I think it did translate over, at least to clay. He had a pretty good clay court season. Finals of Madrid, very close to taking out that title as well. Took a really great Casper Ruud clay court performance. We know his track record on the surface to edge him out there. Wasn't the best grass court season, but he has flashed on that surface already before, being the Brit. He is comfortable, familiar with it. And look, the bottom line is, he has done the work to get himself where he needs to be. It's obviously now really just a matter of, can he stay on court more than anything else? Maybe he's a guy moving forward that has to just pace himself and schedule in a manner where you're playing, I don't know, like in the 50s of matches all season. I said this about the last spot with Shelton, and it's even more so with Jack. I think this year definitely could have graded out probably anywhere from like a B+ to maybe even a borderline A. Like, even the Roland Garros loss to Bublik was, if you watched the match with Bublik like peeking out of his mind, an acceptable L. The only real like disappointing part of his year, I would say, was like grass season. Other than that, I only stick him at a B because of the availability facet. And obviously right now, that's going to be first and foremost what we keep tabs on with Draper in the near future. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, this dude's a tank when he can stay on court. And with that, grades handed out for all of your top 10. Let's take a swing at 2026 year-end top 10 predictions. Your top 2, inevitably, I think, are going to be Sinner and Alcaraz in one way or the other. I'm picking Sinner to reclaim year-end number 1, really solely off the fact that, and I've talked about this before, but Alcaraz obviously is a different player than Rafa. We know this stylistically, their approach, etc., etc. But I do feel the common thread there is the clear physicality. There's a degree of physicality and violence that is demanded and is a feature in both of their games, and compared to their rivals makes it just a little bit more demanding for them to play well. And of course, it's all relative. Nobody's expecting Alcaraz to go slamless next year. in all likelihood, Carlitos will have a year that everybody on tour would take with their eyes closed. But I do think it's fair to say he's coming off his first all-time great season in 2025, even though for him there's plenty of room to improve upon his 2025 quarter one results from January to March. I do think compared to his rival and Sinner, it's going to be a little bit harder for him to maintain upon the pace that he was on through most of the last 3 quarters of 2025. I think compared to the rest of the field, he'll be beating everyone out, but I think compared to like Yannick, there'll just be a little bit more streakiness. Sinner, meanwhile, I've mentioned it this year, but he has one of the highest floors that I have ever seen. It's now the first time since the mid-2000s Roger Federer dynasty that we have seen consecutive 90+% winning percentage seasons. And it comes out of Yannick Sinner in 2024, now 2025. And yeah, it just looks so reproducible. He could literally do this all day. There's no point in the season where it looks like the guy is out of gas. I mean, you get to the end of the year where most guys are tiring. He looks as irresistible as he does in any point of the year indoors at the end of the year. And even the portions of Yannick Sinner not at his best, like the North American hardcourt swing this year, he still looks like he is not in any type of danger against everybody else not named Carlos, like 99% of the time against the rest of the field. And that's just relentlessly going to keep coming, and I am expecting that to see him reclaim the world number 1 at year's end. Number 3, Taylor Fritz. This sort of is a prediction that I came to by process of elimination a little bit. I do feel like it's probably one that's most subject to being wrong, because there are a certain amount of people that I feel like if it pops for them, particularly for young guys, I can see the upside clearing that of Fritz's pretty easily. So why do I have him ending 3? Well, like I said, I think of the people in his generation, of that 90s gen, he is the only one right now who is in his prime. You could say that about Demon as well, but Fritz, of course, has bigger weapons, and there's just more ability for him to punch up. And I do feel in a ranking sense, it's a little bit of a Zverev situation. Of course, relative to Prime Zverev, I think clearly Zverev has the higher ceiling and is a better player, but it is the same kind of idea where it's like you play a lot, you go deep a lot. Of course, when thinking about rankings, Zverev being at his best on clay, I think that's more conducive to ranking success versus Fritz, who I do feel can still be a lot better on clay than he was this past year, but he does probably suffer from a part of the season where he thrives in grass season being shorter. But still, yeah, I do feel like for Fritz, it's sort of a now or never situation, and he's in good position, considering the fact that this is probably close to the best he ever will be. That in tandem with the fact that a lot of your contemporaries in decline, the guy in Djokovic who still superseded you in 2025, another year of age, will be a year shy of 40. You would just naturally expect some sort of regression there from the prior year. And we're probably reaching the end of a window where the younger guys are still in the midst of their development to really make a siege on that top echelon and a ranking as high as 3. I kind of only think of Draper right now, who is ready to be that sort of threat of that crop of players. And frankly, I probably would have had him 3 if not for receiving the news that he's still not ready to give it a go in Australia. Fritz, a bit of an Iron Man, performing as well as he has in slams and against top opposition over the last 2 years, which was something that he really suffered with even when he first broke through as a top player. I think a good shot upcoming for him to have a career best season. Number 4, after being down so much on Zverev's 2025, it felt like I should have had him slipping more, But again, the Zverev formula has been tried and true in churning out these high rankings, and even if it's a lesser version of what it's been moving forward, I feel like the staple volume and consistency he brings, it kind of locks him in as a top 5, fringe top 5 guy at the very least. And for what it's worth, even if it didn't end up being a springboard back to what we've become accustomed to for him, I do think at the end of the year he showed some very important flashes that he does still have a really high level apex. We hadn't really seen it all year, especially after Australia, but I think seeing it against Jannik Sinner indoors at that in Vienna to a lesser degree, I thought it was one of the more high-level Medvedev-Zverev matches in the Paris Masters as well. Seeing that he still had that, even if it was just for a couple matches, I still feel Zverev's at a point where, even if he is in decline, I don't feel like it's going to be a let go of the rope type situation. So while I do feel big picture trajectory is on its way down, I still do feel like he has more in the tank, and that it's going to be more of a gradual situation than, like, say, a Medvedev, one of his contemporaries, and who is stylistically a little similar. Number 5, I'm still keeping Jack Draper up here. I'm going to choose to look at this Australia situation more as a glass half full person, because I saw what happened in Australia in 2025, where clearly he was still hampered by the hip, and maybe not taking this measure a year ago just set the health up for a situation where it was doomed to fail. I definitely think it can be good here that they're looking big picture, especially at a point in Jack's career where it is really important that, given right now he's ticking all the boxes, a guy that's a great athlete, great mover, great firepower, so complete from every part of the court. I think it's great that it seems like he and his team understand that the most important thing right now is getting him on court and getting him to stay there. And if that means sacrificing one of the slams, if he's coming back 100% as opposed to a year ago, that probably will go a long ways in keeping him on court, in at least keeping him out there from like February to September, October. And yeah, if that's the vision, if that's what they're aiming to do, I have no questions on the tennis side of things again. Number 6, Djokovic. I sort of touched on this. For my money, clearly the third best player in tennis in 2023, but for the second year running, he will be playing such a limited schedule. We understand that, and that makes it so he sort of needs the immense production he had in the slams in 2025. And whether that be for health or a little bit of regression that maybe we saw in the second half of 2025, could be regression, could just be rust with the lack of tournaments he played leading into the US Open, coming off the injury at Wimbledon. But whatever the case may be, this is obviously just a tough model to be sustainable from a ranking sense, and especially the last 2 years, health becoming a part of this picture as well on Djokovic's end. I think it's great to see that he's trying to hone in on that aspect, bring in new voices on his team. That'll keep him motivated to stay out there. But with health, and at his age, I do feel like that stuff is just naturally going to tend to get worse before it gets better. Nonetheless, he's still in a spot where, within the lines, once the ball is in play, the wheels have far from fallen off. For mere mortals, even the 38, 39-year-old version that is statistically among the worst Djokovic seasons ever, he is still damn near impossible to beat for mere mortals in the confines of best of 5. Really is a weird situation. I've said this before, but he's in sort of no man's land where he has clearly declined, but there's levels to this, and because he is still that skilled, still that good, his version of decline has actually just gone ahead and still outlasted the 90s gen, and really, it is just the two generational guys, 10 plus years his juniors, that stand in his way. But at the same time, he is still continuing to put himself in position to where he's knocking on the door, still putting himself in position for something crazy to potentially happen. And of course, part of that is himself now, where his own health, his own body is a part of that equation for everything to go right. And it really is considering that factor that I do feel he's due some slight regression off a year of 4 major semifinals, even a Masters final at that. Has to play such a limited schedule at his age. Won't take much really of slippage from the prior year for it to make this type of impression in the rankings. But yeah, Novak Djokovic, he's still here. He's number 6. 7, I'm still expecting Ben Shelton to be at least a top 10 mainstay, and I'm gunning for a return to Turin. I think out of 2026, I'd most like to see Ben get better week to week, particularly in best of 3. But other than that, we're probably just going to continue to get what we've been used to, and that's him knocking off 1 or 2 big runs and some big events. Really just going to be about getting more and more polished, deploying the big weapons, serve, forehand as efficiently as he can, shoring up the weaknesses as best he can. The quicker that happens, the better that he can supplement his big runs throughout the year with more week-to-week success. I don't expect that to be ironed out completely this season, but yeah, trust the process. I'm still a Ben Shelton believer. He lands at number 7. Number 8, Lorenzo Musetti. I think that for him, this could also be the beginnings of him becoming a bit of a fixture in Turin. I don't know how you couldn't be sold after what he's done on clay for the better part of the last 2 years. I think he has a real chance to sort of usurp and take that torch from Casper Ruud as the guy whose bread is buttered on the dirt. But also, Musetti has already shown he can play on grass. Musetti, I think, especially to close 2025, showed real steady improvement on his weakest surface on the hard courts. And like I mentioned on his spiel, he's still relatively young. After this 2025 season, I've become a much bigger believer in him. We're at a point where you know what you're going to get on clay, and this year showed he could scale up to as high as the 3rd best player on that surface. Since the summer of 2024, he has been on a straight shot upward trajectory, and I think there's plenty of scope for that to continue in 2026. Number 9, Alex de Minaur, similar to Taylor Fritz. I think also one of the rare 90s guys that is still in the thick of his prime. I think biggest selling point for him is you're going to get a beast on hard courts. He's going to win a lot of matches on the most prominent surface in the sport. His innate limitations make it so you do have those questions still of just how much more he can scale up than he already has the last 2 years. But I still feel like he's at the age where he still has a year or a couple more still of this version of himself. And you couple that with what he's always had, the insane quick twitchiness paired with just being this dogged, determined competitor whose floor, especially on a hard court relative to the rest of the tour, is just sky high. I think this is still a top 10 player, even if there is scope for him being passed up in the Turin picture. And then my last spot at number 10, and I have struggled with this more than any other. There have been various drafts of this top 10 where I've just swapped out name after name at number 10. And I guess this would be a great time to cover those that I have on the outside looking in, because every name that I'm about to list off, at some point I had filling this 10 spot. Let's start at Felix Auger-Aliassime. I hate, after praising the heater and what I think was the most consistent stretch of his career at the end of 2025 US Open onwards, to leave him out. But really, to keep it short and sweet, I want to see it outdoors. Obviously, I think it's huge that he had his best single outdoor tournament of his career at the US Open last year. But then most of that winning run for him was done with a roof over his head. And I have seen that before. We saw it to close 2022, him going on that long winning streak. I know who he is indoors in a way that we just don't outdoors. I mean, he's played over the course of his entire career a tournament here or there where it really shines through the heights that he can reach on any surface, really. But outdoors, without a roof over his head, it has never been done with a degree of consistency, with the lows actually being very, very low. I do think there was technical improvement throughout 2025 to where the floor for Felix is a little bit higher than it once was. Like I said, at 25, it should have a little bit more clarity for that to be more sustainable, but I kind of want to see it before I believe it for him next year. Elsewhere, you look at the really, really young guys, and the reason I say, and Draper's not even really, really young anymore, honestly, but the only reason I say he's the only young guy that I feel is ready to pop and make a leap that is impactful at the top echelon of the game is because there's so much young talent on tour right now, prominent young talent, whose ability is undeniable. But I do feel like there's knocks on pretty much all of them. Arthur Feast coming off a scary back injury that kept him out of the back end of 2025. Prior to that, he was playing borderline top 10 tennis and won 2 500s in really impressive fashion as well in 2024. But health has, of course, thrown a wrench in his ascent. Mensik, this is the guy of the really young guys who I think his body is actually the most ready. And the skeleton of his game, like, there's a lot to like. There's a guy for a big guy who moves really well. Actually kind of reminds me of a young Zverev in a way. Huge first serve, great big guy mover, some forehand and second serve issues, but in the case of Jakob, I feel like at some point that forehand technique is going to have to be torn down to the studs and built back up, because I just think his forehand issues are much more prominent than even a young Zverev. I think that's still something that's going to need to be patched up for him to fill in all the great potential that he brings to the table. Great competitor as well. Obviously, everyone remembers the Miami run. Also one of the most impressive Masters runs of the entire season. But that's why I'm holding off on him. Fonseca, it was a great year, I think, for a teenager still. A great, if not uneven season, but you do expect that. And that really does center around the fact that Joao, I think, still does not have the body yet that will probably make him a fixture at the top of the game in years to come. He's like the quintessential guy that I have alluded to when talking about the young guys that I feel is a year away. Everything else, almost tennis-wise, there's so much to like, of course. Most prominent of which being probably the most, like, uniquely huge forehand we've seen since Delpo, where it's just so much fun to just hear the sound, the crack off the racket once he gets a hold of a forehand to tee off on. But yeah, otherwise, nice 2025, won a title in South America, obviously. Some nice wins at majors, beating Rublev in Australia, Hurkacz at Roland Garros. I believe at least got a win at every single major this year. Some nice exposure in the best of 5 format. Got multiple wins at a couple of the majors as well. And then, of course, the Basel title at the end of the year to put a bow on it. I still think he's a year away, mainly down to needing to still fill into his body. I still think that athletically he's still not ready to stand up to the toils of the full tennis calendar, as well as the ebbs and flows of the best of 5 format in majors to really make an impression there. But otherwise, it's onwards and upwards for Joao Fonseca. I also do want to shine the light on Yiji Lehechka. Very under the radar, had a nice season. The best of his still young career so far. I mean, this is a guy that just turned 24 in November. And since he burst onto the scene making that quarterfinal run in Australia in 2023, he's just pumped out solid season after solid season pretty much every year since. And that's with a 2024 that was hampered by back problems throughout the year. But last year, I believe, a first slam quarterfinal since that 2023 Australian Open one. And doing it this time at the US Open, he had a really nice Queens as well. Beat Minaur Draper, I remember. And then playing what was a pretty high-level competitive final against Carlos Alcaraz, who also handed him the loss at the US Open quarterfinal. He's now, knocking on the door of top 15. You know what you're going to get. It may be one-dimensional, but he's among one of the cleanest ball strikers on tour. Hits big off both wings and can do it with a great degree of consistency. That's another guy that, I don't think it would take much to see him touch the top 10 at some point here soon. I'll also talk about a vet I'm leaving out in Casper Ruud. I do think, uniquely for him, among the 90s guys and the OG next-gen crew, and yeah, I'm including Rublev, of course, Medvedev, Tsitsipas. So far, so good, actually, for him in early 2026 action. Even to an extent, Zverev. I feel like compared to all of those guys, as far as 2025 goes, it feels like Casper is the guy that is least removed from, seeing his apex among all those guys. For a couple of them, we're going on multiple years almost now. Zverev, few and far between last year. But for Ruud, can you really say that 2025 was that dissimilar from what we've come to expect from Casper? Already talked about it before, but he scored a really, really quality win in the final and overall beat a lot of good players to win Madrid and played just exceptionally well there for a really well-deserved maiden Masters crown. Your main difference really is that this year he suffered an injury at the worst possible time. Rome and Roland Garros, traditionally those have been locks for Ruud to excel in. And that's the bare minimum. Usually, he's still making deep runs elsewhere on clay. This year, his season just sort of got sabotaged in the middle chunk of it to where post-Wimbledon clay, somewhere he usually picks up points, that portion he was still hampered. You look at, his draw at Roland Garros this year, he was in the Alcaraz quarter. I don't see why he wouldn't have gotten there without getting injured. Obviously, elsewhere, the production on grass has been non-existent. You can write off him missing that piece of action, but, on the hard courts, considering, again, post-2021-22, the production has slowed up quite a bit, but for what it's worth, there were some highlights. Namely playing a red-hot version of Carlos Alcaraz in Tokyo this year really well, easily his toughest match there. And then validating that with, I would say, one of the better 250 runs of the season in Stockholm. And playing one of his better matches on hardcourt ever in the final against Ugo Humbert. Indoor hardcourt Ugo Humbert, I might add. So you get the picture. I don't think it's that dire for Ruud. I totally could see him knocking on the door. I feel like if he doesn't get injured at Roland Garros this year, he probably is in the top 10. And you're looking at his year completely differently. Obviously, the issue for him is how much variance there is for him off of a clay court and the hard court results in particular. I do feel like rankings-wise that makes for a much lower ceiling where he's probably, if he returns to the top 10, a guy who's 7 through 10-ish. But of the guys I'm talking about, he is right up there at the top on the outside looking in of guys that easily could prove me wrong. You also talk about Alexander Bublik in this mix. He really leveled up this year after the Phoenix Challenger, and at some point coming up here before March, he probably will be peeking his head into the top 10, which is a fabulous culmination and achievement for all the great work he has done since March of last year. But the bone to pick with him, I'm sure a lot of other people have this, is just trepidation, doubt that he's going to stay dialed in like this for the rest of his career, or at least the next couple of months, the next year or so. I lean more on the side of no than yes, but hey, he has completely changed as a player. I mean, he's gone from a guy that was just big serve, trick shots, YOLO mentality to like a serious tennis player. So I do feel like the version that we saw from the spring onwards to the end of the year is pretty close to as good as it can get for Bublik. We'll have to see also just how long, this sort of new discipline and attitude of his sticks around. But I'm yet to mention Daniil Medvedev here, and that is because he is my number 10. I'm going to say straight off the bat that I think 2019 to 2023 Daniil Medvedev is probably a thing of the past here. I don't think he's ever going to see those highs again, because I just think that he's hit a point in his career, he's hit an age where physically he can't be. And if you're looking at him relative to that guy, he's a lot more mortal. A lot more guys are live to beat him pretty much everywhere that we have gotten used to him being like super comfortable at. But that being said, I first off think there is just no chance, and so should you, that the guy goes through the entire season and wins one Grand Slam match the entire year. And again, that does loom over the fact that Medvedev had some decent runs even before the fall this year. Like, he continued to be, what's been a shockingly great run at Indian Wells, a court that he used to hate. For him, a perfectly adequate clay court season pre-RG. It was fine on grass, like he made the Hala final. The only spot where it was like truly horrendous was the summer hardcourt swing. That again, that is a period of the season that made Medvedev's claim to fame in 2019. But the last 2 years, he has been awful in the North American hardcourt swing, even more so in 2025. He is clearly a lesser version of himself, but that lesser version is coming again from a guy that we were used to, that on hard courts we pretty unanimously considered a tier 1 guy. And yeah, anytime you fall from that height, if it doesn't just like blow up in your face, which at times this 2025 season it did look like it was for Daniil, but falling from those heights, that lesser version of yourself still is a pretty formidable player. I think especially with him closing strong, regaining some of the confidence that had hit rock bottom in the summer, that's enough for me to say that I don't think it's completely over for Daniil yet. The 1 slam victory playing all 4 slams is one of the wildest stats I've ever seen out of a player that good. I feel like that's a case of like the low end of variance. I feel like that's bound to revert to the mean, at least with Medvedev returning to like second weeks, and I still feel like that should be enough for him to still return to being a top 10 player next year. So that brings a close to the top 10 predictions. Real quick, I'm going to just speed by my slam predictions because I did this last year. I had Sinner Australia, that was correct. Djokovic Roland Garros, he fell in the semis. Alcaraz Wimbledon, and Alcaraz US Open. I ended up getting 1 out of those 2 correct. Went into this year still believing that if Djokovic could summon his very best, he was still very much in the picture and the gap hadn't widened enough. And that, it was more so a 2024 where his motivation clearly dipped off and health started becoming more of a problem. 2025, certainly not the case. I mean, Djokovic brings his best now even. It's clearly an uphill battle against both these guys in Sinner and Alcaraz. I think at the end of 2026, it will be 12 straight majors for Sinner Alcaraz. I will go a different combination this 2026 season than we saw in 24 and 25. I will go Sinner Australia for the three-peat. I will go Sinner to complete the career Grand Slam first at Roland Garros. Honestly, in 2025, I thought the best tournament that Sinner played of the 4 slams was at Roland Garros. He was irresistible and just like blew me away at that tournament, where again, like given the track record on clay, I just did not expect him to just immediately come out of the gates of his suspension, hit the ground running, and play that sky high well. I fully believe now it's only a matter of time before he wins that Roland Garros and the titles on clay begin to grow from just Umag to this point. I will say Alcaraz takes back Wimbledon. He is now 0-2 against Sinner at that tournament. While both were still relatively young and early in their tennis journey, completely different players in 2022. But it was a very scratchy stay at SW19 throughout the course of the entire tournament for Alcaraz this year. I think he's capable of playing a whole lot better there. And then the US Open, I also go Alcaraz there. This was probably the best tournament he ever played, the US Open in 2025. He looked just stupid good and unbeatable. That record of 5 at the US Open is the most obtainable, and I do expect it to fall by career's end. Maybe to both of these guys, but that's what I'm going for the breakdown in the slams next year. And yeah, that brings a close to probably by far the longest video on this channel ever. I will see if I want to break this down into 2 parts. Might have to be done, but yeah, we are off. 2026 season, Australian Open, just around the corner. We get a draw on Thursday. Can't wait. Should be a blast. I will catch you guys in the next one.